Hello, and I have the distinct pleasure of introducing you to the moderator of our panel. We are so fortunate to have Dr. Joyce Malyn-Smith moderating the panel today. Dr. Malyn-Smith is the Director of Strategic Initiatives in Workforce and Human Development at EDC and a national expert on STEM career development and workforce education. Dr. Malyn-Smith's research focuses on the future of work and its implications for lifelong learning. She investigates the dispositions humans will need as they partner with machines in problem solving, what it means to be human in the age of AI, and the foundational skills K through 20 students need to prepare for work at the human technology frontier. She also leads a body of work that explores how to enhance STEM learning and support people in using their STEM skills, knowledge, and dispositions to produce productive and rewarding careers. Her projects develop industry education connections in computational thinking, big data, AI, and other advanced technologies. Dr. Smith collaborates with community colleges to advance knowledge of the expertise needed in emerging occupations and in occupations that are changing dramatically due to new technologies. She also develops standard-based tools and resources, as if the other stuff wasn't enough, to ensure schools align their programs and curricula with changing industry demands. Knowing that you are in such good hands, I'm going to hand the mic over to you, Joyce.
Thank you very much. And you know, I've developed all of these interests because I spent 20 years in public education in Boston Public Schools. 10 of those were working with the CTE programs at the central office level. So today's topic is using data to monitor access and equity and improve CTE and work-based learning programs. One of the things we've learned about the future of work is that the need for data literacy and fluency is permeating all industry sectors. In addition to data-based decision-making, industries riding the wave of discovery and innovation are working at the intersections of big data, computer science, and science to build structures, to design systems, to create vaccines, to splice genes that allow us to cure disease and to address our world's most intractable problems. With data all around us and with access to all types of data to answer important questions, more and more educators are relying on data to drive decisions about programs and to solve problems related to equity and access. We've learned that discovery comes from both the intersections of disciplines and from the integration of diverse skills, knowledge, and perspectives. It's with equity and access that we'll cultivate a next generation workforce who will be the designers, the builders, the creators, the discoverers, and the innovators that help us maintain our leadership in a world driven by technology. Our panel today touches on both of these important uses of data, educational data-based decision-making, and how to use those data to ensure equity and access. In our discussion, we'll hit on questions educators should be asking. Things like, what data are used and are needed to understand barriers to equity? What skills are needed by educational practitioners and policymakers to use data effectively? And how do we communicate the importance and the value of CTE? Our panel includes 3 speakers, starting with Katherine Shields, an EDC researcher on CTE. Katherine will provide the REL perspective and what the REL has been doing to support states in their efforts to develop more robust work-based learning data systems that can produce evidence to drive policy. She'll also help us learn from other IES-funded projects about what it takes to improve data quality in CTE and work-based learning. We'll then move to Jess Juliuson, our in-house expert on CTE career academies and career pathways at the secondary level. Jess will provide a program perspective, including the kinds of data high schools are exploring to determine equitable access to CTE, about messaging about CTE to family and communities, and what kinds of skills are needed by school personnel to dig deeply into these issues. We'll then move to Catherine Imperatore from the Association for Career and Technical Education. Catherine will provide a perspective on CTE practitioners' data and research challenges and needs, including the difficulties of exploring issues of equity by program area, and will share ACTE resources and partnerships related to CTE data. Each speaker will start by introducing themselves and sharing some of their initial thoughts on the topic. I'll then ask them to respond to some provocative questions, and we'll then open it up to questions from the audience. Please post your questions in the chat as we move forward through the presentations. Raise your hand if you want to pose questions verbally, or just jump in if you find a space. And please also feel free to build off of each other's comments. So let's get started. Katherine Shields, would you like to start by introducing yourself and providing us with some initial thoughts on these topics?
Sure. Thank you, Joyce. I'm Katherine Shields, and I've been with the REL at EDC for the past 8 years. My research focuses primarily on college and career readiness, and I have a particular interest in career and technical education, especially models like career academies and early college programs and work-based learning. In the past few years, REL-NE has worked with state agencies in the region, including some folks who are in the room today, to help you develop more robust data collection that gives state and local agencies the information you need to make policy decisions. So working with our REL-NE partners, and I want to acknowledge folks on the teams like Ellen Cushing, Jessica Griffin, Jessica Bailey, and Audrey Gallo. We've worked with state education agencies in Rhode Island and New Hampshire to do things like developing a data inventory of CTE outcomes to be able to see what data is actually available around the student outcomes that students achieve through participation in career technical education. Conducting gap analyses to see what are the career readiness indicators available in accountability systems or data systems, and adding new measures where needed to the state data collections where important information was missing. And specifically for work-based learning, developing definitions and rubrics to say what is quality and how to assess that quality. And just as an example, I'll drop a link in the chat. I hope Rhode Island doesn't mind that I'll brag on you guys, but Rhode Island developed a high-quality work-based learning rubric, which the REL was involved in helping with, which I'll just drop in the chat. I think it's a nice example. And this year, as you know, in Vermont, if you would have heard this yesterday in our breakout session, or you'll hear about it this afternoon, we're embarking on a review of available CTE and work-based learning data with input from local work-based learning coordinators at the local level and looking at the supports and barriers available for collecting those data. So through all of this work with the REL, as well as with educators in other parts of the country, we hear a lot about the challenges for schools and districts to gather these kinds of data. It's not a light lift. So we've also been trying to document what does it take to put these kinds of data systems in place and provide some resources for, especially for districts, to help them do that. So I wanted to share a couple of things about resources we've been creating with support from the Institute of Education Sciences, which also funds the RELs. One is a work-based learning data collection toolkit, which is designed for districts. And again, I'll put the link to that in the chat just so you have that. And that's really designed for districts who are thinking about trying to improve or build out their work-based learning data collection systems with some kind of practical tips that we've learned in the field. And we're also currently starting on a new project to profile innovative district practices. So we can kind of provide some examples that other districts can learn from about ways to gather work-based learning data. And this is, especially important right now as many states are adding greater accountability around work-based learning and adding that as a measure for their Perkins metrics. So we've seen a lot of interest and need across districts for that. So through the CTE Research Network, we are gathering information about these districts and going to profile them. And I will say, as an aside, if you know of a district that's doing something really exciting and interesting, please do, you can drop it in the chat or email me with suggestions, because we're just at the recruiting stage right now. So I will pass it on back to Joyce.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that REL overview of the work that you're doing there to support database decision-making and what we're doing with that. Let's move on now to Jess. Jess, would you like to provide some of your thoughts about the program perspective?
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be in this group today. I have to say, I was overlooking all the notes from yesterday, and I wished I had been a fly on the wall and could continue to be in your meetings. It's really inspiring to me to see so many states coming together to collaborate and to share practice, and it's just more aligned than what we usually see. So to me, it's really exciting. So as Joyce said, my name is Jessica Juliuson. And my work at EDC has really been focused on advancing career-ready education. And I would say that's both CTE and other contexts. And in developing and supporting the kinds of resources and skills that practitioners really need to do it well. And I was a high school teacher myself, and I usually say I moved sideways out of the classroom, kind of accidentally, and I was coaching other teachers and then eventually school and district administrators in how you integrate relevant and meaningful learning experiences across disciplines, and what kind of structures you need in place that will support that kind of teaching and learning. And so I now surprisingly have been in education more than 30 years, and I currently work with states, districts, and school leaders and teams from really all over the United States, as well as internationally. And for me, CTE really provides the best, most impactful context for helping learners be ready for the future of work. And I mean that from preschool all the way through the adult years. And specifically for the last several years, I have worked extensively with career academies, which Joyce mentioned. And so for those of you who aren't as familiar with them, career academies are high schools which are organized into small learning communities and focused around specific career pathways. They're much less common in the Northeast than in other parts of the country. And they provide a really interesting kind of microcosm of the challenges of equitable CTE, and there's some great stories that have emerged from their data. So today I'm really speaking from not an evaluator or a researcher perspective, but much more the work on the ground, kind of what data feels like in CTE, the skills it requires, and the kinds of influence it can have or not have, as the case may be, on practice. So in thinking about today's panel, when invited to share a few thoughts, I was reminded that CTE on paper can be really different from CTE in practice, and data can be both a friend and an enemy in helping us figure out what is actually happening, what's being practiced, what's happening as a result of those practices, and why we're seeing the results that we see. And so in the course of this work, I've really, a few thoughts come front of mind. And the first one is that the data we can most easily collect and analyze is not always the data that will tell us what we want to know. And so particularly when it comes to asking questions about equity, access, opportunity, and student outcomes, it can be really easy to fall back on data that confirms and affirms current practice, the way that we've always done this kind of thing. Because then you don't need to invite the kinds of complexities and difficulties and implications that come with findings that maybe we are hoping we weren't going to find. And so I say that just to say there's a push to really try to stay the course and to collect the data that will encourage us to do so. And the second thought that I had is that data for evaluation and reporting can often supersede or conflate with data for improvement, and it can get in the way of really developing a very rich data-informed culture. And I say that because we're living in a culture of accountability, which is necessary, though it's not a sufficient driver for change, particularly when there's really deeply rooted inequities in our systems. However, accountability does not always support measurement for improvement. It's a different purpose. And improvement measurement and data requires really safe and transparent spaces for practitioners to grapple with the gaps that emerge, the barriers that emerge, maybe practices that they're finding are more ineffective or maybe misdirected. And so the people who need to be engaged in this kind of data inquiry are not always the people tasked with practicing. So we know that districts have, we all know there's that person or that group sort of at central office who does data. And that's usually not the people in the classroom, which is where the work is happening. And so there are exceptions to that, but thinking about how we're creating those spaces for practitioners. And then a third one is really that states, schools, and districts often struggle with allocating the appropriate amount of resources or time to understanding root causes behind their data. And I say appropriate amount in quotes because exploring root causes can kind of fall into two traps. One of them is it can be far too complicated and mystified to the point where educators think that only experts can do it. And therefore they don't own the process. They feel removed from it. They kind of hand it over to people with more mystique who know how to explore root causes. And so that really separates them from the kinds of insights they could gain. And a second trap is that it's engaging everybody very lightly, and it's done in kind of too speedy or superficial a way, in which case the questions aren't really as likely to be probing or really get at root causes or what's happening. So finding that sweet spot, the right amount of time, the right amount of resources and people is challenging, I think, for systems. And so those are three things that I'm looking forward to talking more about and learning from you, how your experiences have related to that or connected to that in your own CTE context. So thanks, Joyce. I probably took too long with my intro.
Thank you so much, Jess, for that really interesting programmatic perspective. Let's turn it now over to Catherine Imperatore. And Catherine, if you can share with us a little bit about the research challenges and perhaps some of the ACTE resources that are available.
Sure. I'm so happy to be here today. Thank you for having me. As Joyce mentioned, I'm from the National Association for Career and Technical Education. So if you don't know us, our members are the teachers, faculty, administrators, counselors, work-based learning coordinators, all the staff on the ground locally that are implementing CTE programs on the secondary and post-secondary levels. So we provide professional development for our members. We advocate for federal CTE policy, and we work with a lot of partners on issues of data accountability, research, and implementing the current version of federal CTE legislation, the Perkins Act. So some of our resources, if we can go to the next slide, include an evidence-based set of criteria that define a high-quality CTE program of study. It's the ACTE Quality CTE Program of Study Framework, which we developed. It includes a self-evaluation that CTE programs can take to see how they measure against these criteria, and a related resource library. And we encourage our members to use this for program improvement, to identify professional development needs. We also provide a lot of technical assistance on implementing federal CTE policy. And because federal CTE policy, with our latest iteration of Perkins 5, has really focused on equity and data needs, a lot of our TA is around that. So particularly the comprehensive local needs assessment, which is required of local providers to receive Perkins funding, and includes analyzing both disaggregated learner data and labor market data. And we also provide assistance on topics like engaging learners, engaging representatives of special populations. ACTE is also one of the leads of the CTE Research Network, which is an IES-funded network to promote causal research in CTE and to develop researchers' ability to conduct causal research. A lot of CTE research in the past has been more descriptive or correlative. And so now we're really promoting and digging into research that really seeks to ask, did CTE cause X outcome, or did an element of CTE cause X outcome? And it's very exciting work, but it's definitely in the introductory stages. So today I'll be sharing with you a little bit about, some of the challenges that we hear from in the field, some of the innovations that states and locals are carrying out, and some of the questions that we would like to have answered, but I'll save that for the main body. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you to each one of you for your insights and for just sharing out some really useful resources for us. So let's get started with some questions for you. And let me ask you, first question, what questions should educational leaders and policymakers be asking? And what kinds of data should they be collecting to answer those questions? Jess, from a program point of view, let me go to you first. What are your thoughts?
So it's a great question, and I know it's one that everyone's here to kind of think about. And the first thing I'd say is that I think that there are good questions that leaders and policymakers should be asking about equity and access overall. And then there are good questions they should be asking about CTE programming more specifically. And so one insight I would have is that those two streams of data inquiry should really be happening concurrently and in alignment with each other. And I say that because often CTE data inquiry is happening in a different bucket than other kinds of data analysis and inquiry that are happening at the same time. And they really shouldn't be siloed like that, because oftentimes findings are rooted in the same kinds of systemic causes or contextual influences. So you can find some strategies that actually address both CTE programming and programming more broadly. So I think that's kind of one thing I would suggest that leaders think about, is where is that happening and how are we aligning those efforts? And so I won't speak as much about the general equity and access questions, as you're all very aware of resources for those, I'm sure, although I will put a plug in and I'll share in the chat later. There are some great resources in equity and access data from the Nellie Mae Education Foundation, which focuses on advancing racial equity in public education, and they focus specifically in the New England region. And then for the Coalition of Schools Educating Boys of Color, or COSBOC, which has a really outstanding and practical research-based operational framework that they call the Uncommon Core. And this resource provides standards and indicators that schools and districts can use to dig into core areas of their system, including curriculum, school climate, things like that. So I'll put those links in the chat a little bit later. But for CTE specific questions, I think that there are a few important barriers to access that have emerged where we should be asking questions. And I'll share some thoughts and then kind of pitch it over to Katherine Shields, because I know she's done a lot deeper research in this area. But to me, one rich area for investigation is really access. It seems obvious, but asking students, which students have access to which CTE classes, to which career pathways, which academies, post-secondary programming, and eventually careers. And so that question, of course, is important to ask, but more importantly, that question needs to be followed up with further questions that help you better understand who actually uses that access, who stays, and who succeeds in that programming. And if they don't, why don't they? And I think a great example of this is when districts could explore, for example, overrepresentation or underrepresentation of student populations in a particular program or pathway. And for example, I think of an aviation academy that we worked with in Polk County, Florida. And of course, as one might expect, they had a much higher ratio of self-identified males to females in their aviation academy. And so one could have just looked at their data and said, well, we provided equal opportunity and access to everyone, males and females, because we invited both to apply. They had the same information, they had the same, preliminary marketing and communication. So our due diligence is done and the numbers are just different. But this particular academy decided not to do that, and they decided they wanted to better understand why. And so they asked questions of their prospective female applicants and found out those students had concerns about a male-dominated academy culture. They had concerns that there weren't a lot of women in the industry in general. They weren't particularly self-confident in the math and science they felt they'd have to do in aviation. And all of this was rationale for why they chose not to apply. And family pressures also, in some cases, helped push them into something that was more traditionally considered a female pathway, like healthcare. And so the academy decided that they were going to start doing some more focused attention on their preliminary work at the middle school level and recruitment and marketing and communication around STEM identity. And they did start to see, as a result, their numbers go up. And I say that because I think that's a great example of taking an initial question around equity and going further with it. So it had a specific equity lens and a specific goal for participation that they wanted to achieve. And so they asked the questions that would help get them there. So that obviously leads into the importance of questions about culture and school climate and the impact that those have on participation. And so I'll probably turn it over to Catherine to talk more about that, as she's done some really interesting work in this area.
Very good. Go ahead, Catherine. Would you like to jump in? Catherine Shields?
Sure. I was just finding my mute button. No, thanks, Jess. And just to touch on a couple of things there, I fully agree that it's really important to go beyond the numbers. As you mentioned, sometimes you really do need to just talk with students about their choices and what's behind them. And, just this week, past week, we were in California interviewing students and teachers and asking them about, why do they choose to participate in certain kinds of work-based learning or not. And, there's a lot of barriers that came up that you probably all know about, like transportation. But with a little bit more digging, we heard some other things like that actually the information didn't get to them. They didn't always know about what was offered. Sometimes advisors were differentially sharing availability of CTE and work-based learning programs and not connecting that with student interests effectively. And then there's the issues around sort of the life responsibilities that families have. Some students were responsible for sibling childcare and they just weren't able to do something that happened after school or in the summer. During the summer, they needed to have a full-time job to bring income into the household. And so the programs have been able to reflect on that and think about, all right, can we bring more employers into the school during school hours when the students are able to be there, and making some changes like that to really make equity happen. But to step back a bit, I agree with Jess that, just understanding access, what's offered and what's available is really important. And, just to go back to what Catherine said, the field is kind of lacking in a lot of research that really tells you what works, what will actually help my students succeed in their life after high school. And can we really tie that to something that happened in their CTE or work-based learning experiences? And to get to that, we need more robust data that'll support that kind of research. And as Jess mentioned, that's not always the same thing as useful continuous improvement data. And so those are sort of two pieces that both really need to be in place. So a couple things that we've seen that are kind of a barrier to being able to kind of answer those kind of questions is that a lot of, especially work-based learning data and some other types of CTE data are not always tracked by individual student. So the school or the district can say, we did an aggregate count and we know how many students participated in this event, but they don't always have the ability to say, this student did these things over time. And then that makes it hard to tell. You can say, well, we have X number of students participated in internships, but do you know, was that or different kinds of work-based learning, do you know, was that a few students who did a whole lot, or was it a really truly reaching a larger range of students? And are there differences between the students who are accessing things? The other thing is that often these data don't necessarily link easily to the main student information system in a district. So it can be hard for a school to run the reports they'd like to see and make a connection to student outcomes or make a connection to other student data that would help them really understand what's happening. And related to that, I think a key piece of data or type of data that's needed to answer these questions about program effectiveness is student outcomes. And again, like Jess was saying, the data that's easy to get is not necessarily the data we really need to know. So a lot of what we think students learn from CTE and from work-based learning is around transferable skills like teamwork, collaboration, problem-solving skills. And those lend themselves more to like an employer review of the student or a student portfolio. And that kind of data really takes more effort to gather and to analyze. So that can present a challenge for educators. And one thought is that some places will do maybe looking at a small sample of students periodically and not try to get that kind of rich data from everyone all the time. But at least I can give you a window into, okay, are these students getting those transferable skills or not from our programs?
Thank you, Catherine. And Catherine, you started talking a little bit about some of the barriers that people have, like transportation, other things you've uncovered. Let's dig a little more deeply into the issue of equity. And can I ask you to respond a bit to what are the data needed to better understand barriers to equity that might exist that we might not be aware of? And then Jess, if you could comment on that. And then after you both do that, Catherine Imperatore, I want to go back to you to ask you about complexities of CTE data. So Catherine, if you can just dig a little more deeply into what are those barriers in understanding equity a little better.
Sure. I mean, one thing that was interesting as we were able to actually link up the individual student data to something else in your student information system, and then you could say more about who's participating and what over time. We've been doing that with a district in California. And, one thing that we found was that we actually, once we were able to say how many hours did a student spend in work-based learning, which types of activities, and what are the demographic characteristics of those students, we were able to look at that and share and discuss that data with educators in the career programs in the schools. And some patterns really came out that they hadn't been aware of. For example, the English learner students were not actually accessing as much. They were doing some things, but they weren't accessing as much as other students. Some students, we saw some difference around academic proficiency. So students who were less proficient were not as likely to be accessing as much. And some of those things were a little bit under the radar and less visible to folks in programs until we were able to kind of work with them to pull that out of the data. So those are some things that can really lead to a discussion around, well, do you need to look at your enrollment, recruiting, intake process for your career programs and for your work-based learning programs, for your internships, and make sure is that actually sort of proactively reaching some of these students who aren't equitably accessing things.
Thank you, Catherine. And Jess, you were talking a bit about equity and access earlier. Can you, from your perspective, can you tell us what data are needed to better understand some of those barriers that may exist that we may not even be aware of?
So I'm going to go a little bit deep here and say this is kind of going to back us out a little bit. And I wanted to talk about the data that we could get about labor market alignment between high skill, high wage jobs in your state and communities and the kinds of CTE programming being offered. And I say that because a lot of times it's sort of backing out to see the forest rather than the trees and the context for your CTE programming. So it's not enough to show that students are succeeding in what's currently offered. It's important to be able to show that CTE programming is going to prepare students for a fulfilling and satisfying career with adequate income. And so states, districts, and schools really need to be up to date and aware of where those economic opportunities are in their communities and in their state, and to ensure that their CTE programming is really providing that preparation and scaffolding. And I say that because I think oftentimes, you can have the highest quality, most wonderful CTE programming available, and if it's in the wrong industry or in the wrong kind of pathway, you may be giving students lifelong skills, and you are, but it's not necessarily providing them with that really clear pathway that they can follow as far as they want to go. And so I say that because it's not often the kind of data we talk about when we're talking about school systems. And there's some really great resources that make it relatively easy to look at this data. So the US Bureau of Labor Statistics has really nice kind of user-friendly tables where you can pick your state and it'll tell you, here are the upcoming career areas and industries and jobs that are going to be most promising for your students. And so, that kind of data and integrating that into the conversation about what you're preparing your students for, I think can be really important. So I'm just going to pop a link into that so that anyone who's curious can take a look at that instead of, let's see. And then the other piece that I would say would be important to look at is data that tell you not just that they're going into these pathways, but that students are staying. And I mentioned that earlier as being kind of an important criteria. It's not just about finding it attractive to begin with, but feeling that you have the efficacy and the skills to stay in it and to graduate from it. I would also mention dual enrollment numbers and tracking those, and any kind of industry approved certifications that are available or that you could offer. Those help you tell a story about what your students are equipped to do, and it helps give students something to aspire to. And it also helps with storytelling. And I know that's something we may talk about later. But for example, a requirement for every graduate in Nashville, Tennessee of the Metro Nashville Public Schools is that all graduates leave with at least one early secondary, post-secondary opportunity and pass at least one industry credential exam. And those are kind of considered nice to haves in a lot of places, as opposed to essential things that students have to have under their belts before they leave. And so even if your program is still growing or it's way too early in the process to really be able to be thinking about that, I think starting to keep that in the back of your mind and tracking and documenting those kinds of opportunities can be really helpful in storytelling.
Thanks a lot, Jess and Catherine. So Catherine Imperatore, these are complex issues. We're talking about labor market in schools and students' progress and achievement on an academic track and their progress and achievement on a technical track, and the equity and the access issues. Tell us, from your perspective, what are some of the complexities of CTE data, particularly when it comes to access and equity considerations?
Yeah, so one of the biggest challenges in CTE data, and Catherine and Jess both touched on this, is that we have so many different siloed data systems that are feeding into answering these questions. You have the Perkins CTE data, you have education department data, post-secondary data, workforce data. Even when you can make connections, often some of the workforce data is like in unemployment insurance or unemployment benefits data that's often pegged to industry and not occupation. So it doesn't give us the full and complete picture. You also have proprietary data held by industry certifiers. So there's just a lot across the system and to integrate. We're really enthused about the growth of state longitudinal data systems that are integrating these different data sets, and that's been remarkable. And we, as an association, we encourage and promote more of that data sharing. Another complexity is that CTE data means very little without a lot of disaggregation. We do have data that shows, correlations between particular CTE program areas and the types of students who participate, as Catherine and Jess both mentioned, differences by gender, sometimes by race and ethnicity, also for student groups like learners with disabilities. We also see some different outcomes across CTE program areas based on where students transition to, if they're going to 4-year, if they're going to community college, into the workforce. So both program level disaggregation and population disaggregation are really important to understand what's going on. But at the local level, and even sometimes at the state level, this results in very small cohorts. You're looking at very small n sizes, and sometimes a lot of noise in the data from year to year when you're looking at these tiny student groups. It's difficult for CTE practitioners who mostly have no training in data analysis to kind of look across all of this disaggregation and try to analyze and understand it. The last challenge that I'll hold up is that positive student outcomes can be defined much more expansively than what is classically measured. In the field, we consider it a good thing for a student to explore a CTE program area, decide that it's not for them, and be able to take that knowledge going forward. And maybe they also, even if it's not a fit, they gained some of those cross-cutting employability skills that we've mentioned, like communication, time management, collaboration, even if that program wasn't a fit. You may have a student who earns an industry credential in high school, goes into the workforce with plans to go later to post-secondary. Is that a success? How can we build and strengthen those pathways and stackable credentials so that that student can get back into post-secondary in the future? So lots of questions, lots of data, lots of disaggregation, and practitioners who need a lot of assistance is the sort of the upshot.
Thank you, Catherine. And, I want to build on something that you said. You mentioned something that triggered a thought with me, and that was about the importance of longitudinal data. And I know through EDC and a lot of research is funded by funded grants from the federal government, but those grants are usually short in terms of the number of years in which they can support the research. It might be 3 years, it might be 5 years. There are very few opportunities to fund long-term research, but within the state public education system, you have opportunities to be able to follow students over time, and perhaps really be able to add to the body of research and to answering some of these questions that no matter how much funding and how much effort is put in by federal agencies to explore these issues, they simply don't have the structure to carry out that long-term view. So I would encourage you to be thinking about ways you can help answer some of these questions over the long term. That would be a really interesting challenge for those of you out there. So Katherine Shields, do you have anything to add to that, or shall we move on to the next question?
I was just going to briefly add in terms of the complexities of data. One thing we found, just like bringing it down to the school where it actually gets collected, is that to capture these very diverse activities that happen as part of CTE, that students are having experiences in different locations and at an employer side or so on, the more tools that you could put in the hands of educators to be able to do that, the better, to make their jobs easier. So for example, they've been some places experiment with using handheld barcode scanners so they can scan students in right when they arrive. Mobile apps on the phone, there's just a lot of good creative new tools out there. And we talk about some of that in the work-based learning toolkit.
Thanks a lot, Catherine. Let's move on to another question. What kinds of skills and competencies are needed to be able to use these data effectively at different levels of the system? Catherine Imperatore, can you jump in and help us answer that question?
Sure. So I'll take this from the local level. With so much data in CTE and with requirements to analyze that data through the Perkins 5 Comprehensive Local Needs Assessment and often statewide state initiatives as well, CTE instructors, they need to be able to read and understand disaggregated data. Administrator level really needs some solid skills at playing with and interpreting data, as well as taking that data through a root cause analysis process, like Jess mentioned earlier. And as I said before, most CTE practitioners are not trained for any of these activities. But now, luckily, we have this sort of carrot and stick with Perkins 5 that this kind of data analysis is required at least every 2 years for local providers to continue to receive their Perkins grants. So we have found in the past few years that states really are stepping up to provide tools to help local providers with these tasks, like robust filterable data dashboards that you can filter by different learner groups, program areas, years, etc. Some states have implemented some training on gap and root cause analysis. Ohio is one. They have been offering these CTE equity labs for the past several years, where teams from each career and technical planning district meet with the state. They learn about disaggregation. They learn about analyzing gaps in enrollment and performance data, and investigating root causes. So these are the types of activities that ACTE, tries to support through our technical assistance and professional development. But yeah, it's definitely upskilling is very much needed in the field, and but we are seeing the beginning of that through some of these gap and root cause analysis trainings.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Jess, do you have anything you'd like to comment on in that regard?
Yeah, I think so. I'm going to confess that I'm a recovering data phobe myself. So this is a very personal question for me. I have a lot of empathy for the educators and leaders for whom this may feel like a really kind of overwhelming skill set, and a lot in addition to what they're already being asked to do right now. And especially as we think about CTE programming becoming more robust and pushes to begin to integrate academic and CTE skills and content, that's a big lift already. And so when you start, asking educators to also think about equity data, equity questions and data, you can kind of feel that anxiety and that kind of really, you're seriously asking me to do one more thing, and this is hard enough, could someone else do that? And so I think that as I've been sort of observing what seems to have the most impact for educators who are actually gathering data, asking questions of data, and looking at it in real time. And I'm talking now about really continuous improvement data. So data for improvement, not evaluation or summative or reporting data, but the kind that you use to change your practice. And so for that kind of data gathering, I think that there's a real misperception that you have to have some a degree in statistics or something like that to do it well. And in fact, I think that it can be really important to just engage people at where they are in a process that feels fairly intuitive. And one of the things that we know is that educators, teachers particularly, already practice continuous improvement. They just don't call it that. And so by kind of finding an entry point, saying, what is it you're curious about? How would you know? And then finding those kind of real-time feasible data collection opportunities that will allow them to just gain some insight. We used to call it, dipstick data. It's just enough to help kind of give you a sense of what's going on or if you're heading in the right direction. And by engaging educators in that practice, which feels meaningful anyway, because it's questions they care about or are curious about, they begin to get more comfortable with the data process. And then you can begin to build those skills in asking deeper questions, and it becomes kind of a work in progress over time. So I am a kind of a big fan of starting with continuous improvement when you're looking to build a data-rich culture. And it feels like the most practical, least imposed, least irrelevant form of data collection and analysis that educators take to. And so I find that as being a really good starting point. And I think that as educators get more practiced in it, it can be, as I mentioned, you can bring along and develop those competencies in asking different kinds of questions, and thinking about different kinds of data that may bring in multiple perspectives they hadn't considered. So those can all be done over time, but they own it in a way that is different than when they're just kind of going to a PD and being trained to look at, data. And then they go back and do what they were doing before. And for leaders, we talked about different levels of the system here. I feel like a skill for leaders that's really important is developing and communicating kind of intentionality and clarity behind the data ask. So for leaders, it's important to communicate why this data matters, and what kind of data it is, what it's going to be used for. And I think that can really help people feel more or less invested in the process. And, thinking about for leaders also, who are the right people to really be thinking about this question? And is it a broad enough representation of people who really genuinely have a perspective that has an impact on the practice or the findings? And so again, I think keeping it as real as we can and as feasible in the practice of everyday work makes it more likely to catch on and to kind of build that culture of curiosity and wanting to answer those questions that is really owned in a way that isn't kind of top down. And so I feel like that's kind of the practical answer. And then as people get more involved, the most surprising individuals get excited about it and want to kind of go deeper.
Thank you very much, Jess. And thank you, Catherine and Catherine, for your comments so far. The way we've divided up the time for this particular session, our time for the panel session has come to an end, and we're supposed to open it up for questions from the field, but I don't see 100 different questions on our list. So I'm going to ask one last question, which I'll ask you to respond to as quickly and as deeply as possible. And it's one I think that's been sort of plaguing the field for generations. And that's, how do we convey messages to policymakers and parents about the value of CTE? What data or evidence would help make that case? So Jess, do you want to jump? Do you just want to continue and tell us from your perspective? And then I'd like to go to Catherine Imperatore and to close with that perspective, unless Katherine Shields, you have something you'd like to add there. So Jess, can you please tell us, how would we convey those messages about the value of CTE, and what kind of evidence might we have to support that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd have sort of three thoughts on this. I've been working a lot with Career Academy leaders who have been focusing very specifically on storytelling and how they're messaging what they do. And so I think the first piece is tell stories. Data helps, but it only helps if it's tied to a story. So you have to have it in the context of something that your target audience cares about. So painting a picture that lets them kind of grab onto it. And it depends on your audience. So if you're trying to message to parents, help them see a vision and a pathway for their child to be happy and successful. If it's policymakers, help them see what is it that they can do to make education really relevant, really prepare their students in a way that for a different kind of future than we might have experienced ourselves. So those kinds of stories, I think, are particularly important. So that's maybe obvious, but I think it's important, and we sometimes forget it, especially if we have lots of great data we want to share. The second piece is, I think, and this is maybe this falls on the leaders a bit more, but emphasizing the why behind career technical education. I think sometimes, particularly when we're working with people who already get the value of it, we forget that case needs to be made sometimes. And particularly as I think about, the wonderful resources we have from other organizations like ACTE, like Advanced CTE, they have some wonderful kinds of, here's why this matters right now. And so there are materials that we can use and adapt and kind of repurpose for our various audiences. So I would say start with the why before we dive too fast into the what or the how. And the third thing I would say, and I think this is particularly relevant in the Northeast, but there's still, we need to reframe stereotypes around career technical education. I think there's still a lot of historic baggage around, students who are supposed to do CTE, in quotes. The vocational education model has been very strong for a long time. And I think there is this kind of sense that students who do CTE are somehow being tracked out of college or away from college. And that's really not the case. In fact, we're seeing that CTE can prepare students and give them advantages and a leg up in ways that traditional education could never do. And so thinking about how we're reframing what career technical education means, who it's for, and the fact that it really prepares you for both college and career and life, as we like to say. And it's not about VOTEC, and it's not about one or the other and tracking kids into one course or the other.
Thanks a lot, Jess. And just for some quick closing remarks on this topic, Catherine Imperatore, do you have anything you'd like to say about how to raise the importance and value of CTE?
Sure, I completely agree with Jess about the value of stories. We also know some messages. There has been some research conducted in recent years by Siemens and Advanced CTE that looked at messages that resonate with parents and students about CTE. And they identified kind of three key messages: gaining real-world skills, exploring careers to find a passion, and having options for college and career success are kind of three keystone messages. As far as data, I'll just pitch like data that we can especially really use in the field is more about work-based learning. So thank you, Catherine and EDC, for all the great work. And I know some of these REL sites to bulk up the work-based learning data that we have out there. Another data area that we're really working on right now at ACTE is about the CTE teacher workforce. Learning more about who are our teachers, their background and preparation, and particularly dealing with teacher shortage questions when you may not show up in the data set. If a program can't be offered at all because you can't find a teacher, then that shortage does not necessarily show up in a data set. So that's an important access question as well. But I'll leave it there and hand it back to Joyce.
Great, thank you. And let's go. Thank you all of you for your comments and your overviews of these really important topics. I'd like to go back into the comments and the questions that have been posed during your presentation. Some of the comments, one from Rhode Island about, some of them had to do with resources. From Rhode Island, if you've been following in the chat, Rhode Island has a uniform chart of accounts, which should enable analysis of resource allocation to the program, class and student level, and could potentially be a resource to examine some of the investments, especially in the equity realm. And then we had both a question and a comment from the higher ed in Maine. I'm intrigued by Jessica's comment about needing to align CTE programs with actual workforce needs. I've been asking myself about this in Maine, particularly who has agency over the question. It cuts across education, the Department of Labor, higher ed, state economists, and she's very interested in reflections on the larger workforce policy landscape. So that's an issue that we may want to talk about. It is a significant issue, more specifically as you move up into community colleges and higher education. Those ties are really made much stronger at that area, and it's sometimes interesting that the foundational skills that need to be developed and aligned with future workforce needs are relatively invisible to educators who are teaching foundational skills at the K-8 level and at the high school level, which is one of the reasons I think why the CTE programs are beginning to move towards early CTE and beginning to address career development at an earlier age, perhaps beginning in grade 6. And then we have from Ethan Cancel, data and accountability from Brockton Public Schools. I wanted to follow up on Amy's great question and Catherine's response. Do we have people that are skilled in teaching what we need? And conversely, with tenure, if you are a highly skilled and tenured teacher of a trade that's hopelessly out of date, what happens? So I'm going to turn that question over to the panelists. That's really an interesting question. Let's start with, do we have the skilled teaching that we need in CTE programs? And what happens? Who'd like to jump in on that? Go ahead, Catherine Imperatore.
I think that dovetails with what I just closed with, which is about sort of the teacher shortage issue in CTE is so complicated because if we can't find a teacher for a cybersecurity program, then we don't offer the cybersecurity program. Similarly, if you have a very excellent skilled teacher, teaching a program that is not considered to be labor market aligned in your area anymore. I do know that a lot of places do try to redirect people into different fields. If it's kind of relatively close, they might be able to teach, if it's a kind of an interrelated program area, they might just be able to switch into teaching that program with just a little bit of brush up. But it may be that more training is needed to be recertified or endorsed in a different program area. So that's certainly a challenge that we see states and local leaders trying to address. So yeah, I'll leave it there and let the others pick up.
Thanks. Anyone else want to comment on that? Go ahead, Katherine Shields.
I was just going to add the importance of having a really active employer advisor board for programs, because they can help, at least within a broad sector, help programs kind of pivot and be current with things that are happening. So, we were talking to folks in a biotech career academy last week, and their advisors were like, hey, you need more on CRISPR, and here are some resources we know about for teaching that. So that can at least help, adjust.
Very good.
I was going to say,
Go ahead, Jess.
Anecdotally, I think there is that shortage, and particularly in specific career pathways where, frankly, industry pays more than teaching does. And so there's not really an incentive, unless you have a true vocation and passion for teaching, to stay in the classroom rather than getting poached away into a company. And so there are some very real shortages in those highly paid areas, particularly if you do have companies in your area. So it's a real tension. And so oftentimes having those higher level, kind of like working with your Chamber of Commerce or having some kind of collective impact organization who works in your area, they can help coordinate some of that so that industry is working with schools more collaboratively, and it doesn't become such a tension. And the other thing I would say is just about this, we all know you don't want to tear a teacher away from what they love and what they've always taught. And so this question of kind of how do we help teachers who are tenured, who are passionate about what they do, but they may be in a more out-of-date pathway or less relevant pathway, how do we help bring them along? And I would say that from what I've seen, that really varies. There are districts where they've basically said, this is what you're doing, and if you don't like it, you need to quit. And then there are other districts who say, let's gradually grow you in this direction. So maybe having a kind of a hybrid academy that moves from, for example, cosmetology to hospitality industry, so that there's a more broader application. And so there's some ways like that districts have tried to kind of accommodate those teachers. And it really depends on, your political situation, how quickly your leadership is wanting to move, what kind of pressure you're getting from the community.
Another thing that you want to
go ahead, Catherine, jump right in.
Sorry. Another thing that you want to make sure is that you are creating pathways and not punishing people. For instance, maybe somebody who's near retirement age who would like to pick up a class or two, but can't work too much because that could threaten retirement or pension benefits. So really just flexible pathways for qualified people to be or remain teachers.
Thank you very much, Catherine. We have two other things I'd like to address before we close this section. One is that Kendra Winner has suggested a resource. Massachusetts has a new report on employment and earnings of high school graduates and has a link for that in the chat. And then a really interesting question from Jerry White, and that's, how do we deal equitably with special populations? Let me turn that over to the panel for your thoughts. How do we deal equity with special populations, and particularly in CTE?
So I can speak about the work. We've been working with Rockford, Illinois, has been thinking about that question very specifically. And so they have done some work in terms of what kinds of work-based learning experiences they can offer to their special populations. And so their whole approach has been, if these are what the skills and experiences we want all of our kids to have, that applies to all of our special populations. And so what they often have done, depending on the limitations of the students that they have or the possibilities, they've tried to bring work-based learning in-house in some cases. And so to try to create some work-based learning experiences that have the structures and supports of school and of the teachers and support systems they have there, while still introducing them to some of these skills. And so as an example, there's print shops, for example, that you can build into a particular school or academy that students can work at, gain work experience, get to know owners, talk, help with marketing, do all of these things. And then they can advance to the degree that they are able to advance, but they're still getting that experience and they're not shut out of it because of what their learning needs bring to the table. So that's one place where there's some interesting work happening. I think we do find that there's a lot of segregation still happening. And so we do find that sometimes it's only some kids who get some kinds of work-based learning experiences to prepare them. But I think it's a question that, as equity has become a larger focus in the past few years, I think it's one that schools and districts are kind of being forced to think more intentionally about.
Thank you. Any other comments from anyone else?
Yeah, one of the levers that can support this, again, through the Perkins 5 comprehensive local needs assessment, does have a requirement for engaging stakeholders across secondary, post-secondary, different agencies, including representatives of different special population groups. Now, of course, in some places, and the CLNA is pretty new. We've only just done this the second time, so it's a work in progress. And in some places, it's the stakeholder engagement is honestly a bit of a box checking exercise, but in a lot of localities, it has been more robust and really building some of those connections and hoping to learn and develop targeted strategies for particular special population groups. So we are optimistic about that helping in the future.
Well, that's great. And I really want to thank you all for a very interesting conversation. And we have a reminder that CTE students will play a really important role in discovery and innovation in future work. Ensuring equity and diversity in CTE pathways will help to ensure that as a nation, we can continue to lead in our world driven by technology. And as we close this session, I have a question for you as board members. This has been a very interesting conversation. Data can be a challenging topic and a complex topic. If you have a chance, I'd like to hear from you writing in the chat. What are your takeaways from this session? And what are the things that, perhaps the kinds of supports that you might need in order to really utilize data in this arena to support equity and access in CTE programs and for continuous improvement? So what supports do you need, and what are your takeaways from this session? And as we transition to the next session for this meeting, if you would jot down some of those thoughts, that might be really interesting close.
Thank you, Joyce. Yes, we're anxious to hear what supports you might need, what you've gotten out of this. I cannot thank the panelists enough for your insights and your wisdom on this topic. It's fantastic. And Joyce, for your very skillful and knowledgeable moderation. We really appreciate it so much.